think I relate to any of my characters. I've played a crack addict from Boston. I've played an Upper East Side princess.
The situation that unfolded around Leslie Sloan, Blake Lively, the Wayfair lawsuit, and this bizarre new declaration filed by Daily Mail reporter James Vazuka has now spiraled into a textbook example of how celebrity litigation, PR strategy, and courtroom maneuvering can intertwine in confusing and sometimes contradictory ways. And the truth of the matter is that every new filing, every supposed smoking gun, every declaration of innocence or bad faith is not just about what's in the papers, but about the optics, the strategy, and the financial stakes that motivate everyone involved. So let's try to unpack this in the clearest way possible, even though Leslie and her attorneys are deliberately making it more convoluted than it needs to be. What happened most recently is that James Vazuka, a reporter for the Daily Mail who has been tangentially involved in this saga for months, filed a brand new declaration. And he did this under the procedural rule that allows someone to file a new motion or declaration if new evidence has come to light. And the same day that he filed this, Blake Lively's side immediately pounced and filed a response saying, "See, Judge, this is exactly why we need the documents we've been asking for. This is why we need production. This is why the other side is stalling." And then, almost like clockwork, Leslie Sloan and her attorneys filed their own response, claiming this so-called new declaration is the proof they have been waiting for, that it demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Wayfair parties acted in bad faith. And because of that, she deserves her attorney's fees and costs to be covered, even though the reality is that she already filed a motion for attorney's fees months ago, a motion the judge has not yet ruled on. And so it feels redundant and tactical that she's now piggybacking off of Vazuka's declaration to re-emphasize her demand for millions of dollars in fees, the justification for being able to file another motion at all is that there's a rule in place which allows a separate or renewed motion for fees if legitimately new evidence emerges. But the elephant in the room is that nothing here is genuinely new, because what James is saying now is effectively the same clarification he made before, namely that Sloan never said Blake was sexually assaulted or harassed by Justin Baldoni or anyone else. And what's really going on is that James has obviously coordinated with Leslie and her team to file this new declaration in the hope of strengthening Sloan's claims for attorneys' fees and to simultaneously undermine the credibility of Wayfair's attorneys, especially Brian Friedman, who has been at the center of this fight from the very beginning. If you step back and look at this logically, it makes little sense that James would suddenly insert himself into this mess again unless he was directly approached, persuaded, and perhaps promised some kind of benefit, whether reputational, relational, or even financial, because otherwise why would he risk further entangling himself in a scandal where both sides are already suspicious of his motives and his past reporting? And the strangest part of all is that this same James sent Wayfair a large batch of documents back in June where he outright called Leslie a liar and said she was running a smear campaign for Blake. So it is insane that now he is apparently aligning himself with her in order to say the opposite. Those June documents explicitly said that Leslie was planting negative stories with him well before Jed Wallace was ever hired, that she was essentially working as Blake's enforcer in the media, feeding him material, coordinating smear angles, and perpetuating a campaign against Baldoni, Wayfair, and anyone standing in Blake's way. So for Leslie to now turn around and file a letter claiming they have a smoking gun, based on James' latest declaration, is ironic because the real smoking gun was in those older communications, where James admitted she was manipulating him to launder stories into the press. Still, Leslie and her attorneys are waving this new declaration in front of a court, claiming it is irrefutable proof that the case was filed in bad faith, that Wayfair knowingly pushed false allegations solely to inflame the public and silence Sloan, and that the only fair remedy is for the court to award her all her attorney's fees and costs pursuant to anti-SLAPP laws and the court's inherent powers. But the problem with that narrative is twofold. First, the people being censored here are not Leslie and Blake, but rather Wayfair, Baldoni, and the members of the public who dared to speak critically of Blake's actions. And second, the defamation case was never solely about a single ambiguous text message. It was about a larger pattern of behavior in which Leslie was actively feeding stories to outlets like the Daily Mail and possibly the New York Times, so narrowing the focus to one line of text is misleading and intentionally reductive, almost like a red herring designed to distract from the broader allegations. The specific text at issue was from James, saying, Now she's saying Blake was sexually assaulted, which is vague and open to interpretation, and when pressed later, James clarified in June 2025 that Sloan never said anything about Blake being sexually assaulted or harassed. But the critical point is that Wayfair never investigated or consulted with James directly about what he meant, and in this new declaration, he adds that he explicitly told Melissa Nathan on December 25 that he never once said or meant that Sloan accused Baldoni of sexual assault. And Leslie is using this as her bombshell exhibit, even though it was literally already in the complaint, meaning this isn't new evidence at all, just recycled material repackaged to look fresh. She's essentially saying, "Look, Judge, they sued me based on paragraph 193 and an ambiguous text message, even though they knew I didn't say that." But the truth is that paragraph 193 was just one sliver of a larger story, because the allegations also included that Sloan was running a broader smear campaign for Blake by planting negative press narratives, so her attempt to portray the entire lawsuit as hinging on one ambiguous phrase is disingenuous. And the real conspiracy was not about one text but about the orchestrated media campaign where Sloan, acting as Blake's publicist, leveraged her industry connections to arrange damaging press in the Daily Mail and potentially the New York Times, since obviously if Blake were to land a major piece in the Times, it would have been coordinated by her publicist and not some random third party, which fits exactly with what Wayfair alleged. When the judge dismissed the case against Leslie, he did not do so because James clarified or because the sexual assault wording was corrected, but rather because the legal bar for defamation against a public figure like Baldoni is extraordinarily high, requiring proof of actual malice, that Sloan not only published false information but did so knowingly or with reckless disregard for the truth. And the judge found that based on the pleadings before him, the plaintiffs had not sufficiently alleged or demonstrated malice, meaning he dismissed the complaint for failure to state a claim. Combined with litigation privilege protections, not because Sloan was vindicated factually but because the legal standard wasn't met. Importantly, the judge did not call the lawsuit frivolous or in bad faith. He didn't slap sanctions on Wayfair or suggest that Sloan was owed fees because of abusive litigation. He simply said the pleadings didn't rise to the necessary threshold, which is why Leslie's new motion is so shaky. To win attorney's fees, she has to convince the court this was all brought in bad faith, but nothing the judge has written so far supports that. And so now she's scrambling to get James to sign declarations and reframe old evidence as new in hopes of swaying the court, which is a dangerous tactic because it opens the door for Wayfair to respond. And in their response, they will be able to submit their own evidence, including the damaging documents they already received from James himself, where he admitted Sloan was manipulating him, meaning that Leslie's attempt to double down could actually backfire by reintroducing evidence that makes her look worse. Ultimately, the picture that emerges is of a publicist desperate to recoup money by any means necessary, trying to spin procedural rules into a payday, and while it's possible the judge entertains her arguments enough to at least review them, it's unlikely to succeed because the court has already ruled on the substantive issues. And so what this looks like in reality is not about truth or justice, but about Leslie Sloan trying to squeeze out a win in the only way she still can, which is through the financial angle of attorneys' fees, and that, more than anything, shows that she and her attorneys are not confident in the strength of the motion they already filed, because if they were, they would not be recycling the same evidence and trying to pass it off as a revelation. They would simply wait for the judge to rule. And the fact that they aren't waiting but are instead coordinating with a reporter to manufacture new filings tells you everything you need to know about how shaky their position really is. Let's sit down and really get into this, because what I'm about to break down for you is absolutely wild, and it's honestly the kind of Hollywood courtroom PR media mess that you could not make up even if you tried. And the deeper I go into these records, and these emails, and these text messages, and these legal filings, the more obvious it becomes that this entire saga is less about facts and truth and more about spin, optics, credibility, and desperation, and we're watching in real time as people like Leslie Sloan and James Vizuka twist and turn themselves into knots trying to protect their reputations and bank accounts while simultaneously throwing each other under the bus. And at the center of it all, you've got Blake Lively and her camp still trying to frame themselves as the victims of a smear campaign when all the evidence points to the fact that they were the ones actively running the smear. And now we have this additional layer of chaos where emails and texts from James himself show that he absolutely was fed material by Sloan, that he used that material to write Daily Mail exclusives that blew up worldwide, that those exclusives shaped the false narrative against Justin Baldoni and Wayfair, and that now, after realizing he might be dragged further into this litigation, he's trying to backtrack by signing declarations for Leslie to make it look like he never said what he said, when in fact the record clearly shows he said it repeatedly. And so when you zoom out, the whole thing becomes this tangled web of contradictions, timelines that don't add up, and shifting allegiances that, in my opinion, make everyone involved look dishonest, manipulative, and frankly incompetent. And what really seals it is that James himself literally admits in his texts to his editor that Sloan framed him. That Sloan created lies that were so outrageous and horrific that he got dragged into signing a declaration he didn't want to sign. And that declaration, in his words, was intended to silence him and prevent him from testifying under oath about the damning evidence he has against Sloan. Because according to him, if he ever were deposed or allowed to go on camera and tell the truth, it would expose the entire scheme that she orchestrated, a scheme which, by his own admission, began before Jed Wallace was even hired, meaning Sloan was planting and spinning stories to the Daily Mail as early as August 8, 2024, which is crucial because Jed Wallace did not start working on this until August 9th, the very day that Daily Mail published the infamous piece about the disturbing truth on the set of It Ends With Us, an article that carried James Wazuka's byline and was riddled with the very narrative Sloan had been pushing to him, namely that Justin Baldoni was abusive on set, that he excluded Blake from decisions about sex scenes, that he rewrote scripts without her input, that he was dismissive of women's perspectives on domestic abuse narratives, and that he essentially steamrolled the creative process to make it all about him, when the truth, as we now know, is that the script had been written by a woman, based on a book by a woman, and had the oversight of Colleen Hoover herself. So the idea that Justin was bulldozing women's input is completely fabricated, yet Sloan and Blake seeded that narrative, James put his name on it, and it exploded globally, which in turn gave Blake the cover to unfollow Justin, to distance herself publicly, and to set the stage for the lawsuit that would follow, all of which makes it laughable that Blake is now pointing to newly unsealed evidence as proof that there was a smear campaign against her when in reality the smear was against Justin, and the proof actually shows she and Sloan were the architects. And let's not forget that James's own texts show he was aware of how dangerous this was for him. Like when he messaged his editor on June 9th saying he was being framed for perjury by Sloan, that she left out context from his declaration, that he was getting death threats and harassment because the public thought he lied, and that he needed to make it clear that he never told Brian Friedman anything about Blake being sexually assaulted, which again shows that James's story keeps changing depending on who he's talking to and what benefits him at the moment. And that is exactly why his credibility is now completely shot, because when a witness contradicts himself like this, when he says one thing in an email, another thing in a text, another thing in a declaration, and yet another thing in a filing, the court and any jury would deem him unreliable, and jurors are literally instructed that if they believe a witness has lied about one significant fact, they are free to disregard his entire testimony. And in James's case, he has lied or at least contradicted himself so many times that no one can take him seriously anymore, which is devastating for Leslie because she has now staked her claim for attorney's fees on his credibility, filing a new motion based on his clarification, hoping the judge will see it as proof of bad faith litigation, but in reality it just reopens the door for Wayfair to file their own response, and in that response they can attach all of James's damning emails and texts where he clearly admits Sloan fed him false narratives, which makes Sloan look guilty, Blake look complicit, and James look like an opportunist. And if that happens, it could completely blow up in Leslie's face, because rather than strengthening her motion for fees, it would destroy her credibility and reinforce the idea that Wayfair had legitimate reasons to sue her. And remember, the judge already dismissed the case against Sloan not because he believed she was innocent, but because the plaintiffs didn't sufficiently plead malice, and he was careful not to call the case frivolous or in bad faith. Which is why Leslie is so desperate now, because the only way she gets attorney's fees is by proving bad faith, and she doesn't have that proof, So she's recycling James's old messages and trying to spin them as new, but the timeline betrays her because James's August 8th email to his editors shows unequivocally that Sloane was feeding him these stories before Jed Wallace ever came on board, which undermines the narrative that Wayfair created all of this out of thin air, and instead supports the theory that Blake and Sloane were orchestrating a smear campaign from the inside long before any lawsuit was filed, and that is what's going to come back to haunt them, because courts take unclean hands seriously, and if it can be shown that Sloane and Blake were actively spreading false narratives in the press, then Wayfair's decision to defend themselves with litigation looks justified, not malicious. So what we're really left with is the circus where Leslie and Blake keep crying foul. James keeps flipping his story depending on whose side he thinks will protect him, and meanwhile the actual evidence, the emails, the texts, the published articles, the timelines, all point to the fact that the smear campaign originated with Sloane, that she weaponized James to plan stories, that those stories shaped global perception, and that when she was sued, she panicked and tried to cover her tracks by getting James to sign declarations contradicting his own words. And that's why I don't think this is the smoking gun she hopes it will be. I think it's just more nonsense that creates the illusion of a breakthrough, but really exposes how desperate and sloppy their side has become. Because if James truly had jaw-dropping evidence against Sloane as he claimed in his text, then why hasn't he presented it? Why hasn't he testified? Why is he instead allowing himself to be used as a pawn in Sloane's motion for fees? And the answer is because he's scared. He knows that if he goes under oath and tells the full truth, it will not only bury Sloane but also implicate him as her willing accomplice, and he's trying to avoid that outcome at all costs. But by doing so, he's making himself look even less credible, and that's why I think this whole thing will end with more chaos, more nonsense, and ultimately more exposure of Blake, Leslie, and James for what they really are, which is manipulators who tried to play both the court of law and the court of public opinion and are now watching it all backfire on them. Thanks for watching. Subscribe my channel, Corevanta.